I left India at the age of 20. Born in Madras, raised in Delhi. My father worked for the Indian government. The memories are fond. You know, it's in my blood. It's who I am. But at the same time, they're very painful. I was not a good student. I was not a happy young man. I wasn't going to make it. My father looked me in the eye and said, "You're going to be an embarrassment to the family." One thing built up to another. He was right the way I was headed. And yet God had another plan. But through the pain and the conflict and the heartache and the tragedy, heading into that crisis experiences, you know, reading the book, God found me in the shadows there of a hospital room where I tried to take my own life. India is incurably religious. I'd be very surprised if there's anything more than a very, very fractional number in India that don't have a religion. Hinduism is 80%, Islam is 10%, and there's Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. It's a religious nation. My parents were nominally Christian. We belonged to an Anglican church. Yes, so it was practiced in terms of ceremony. Did we ever talk about it? Did we ever discuss what it meant? No. I had no disciplines. I had no proclivities, no inclination to study. All my buddies were doing well. I wasn't. But at the same time, there was loneliness. Deep, deep sense of alienation that I really wasn't going to make it. I poisoned myself. I tried to end it that way. I brought in some chemicals from the lab. Didn't succeed, but I tell you, nearly did. And what happened was the poison got in, and one of the poisons was very salty. It set up the gag reflex, and I started throwing up. And John 14 was opened up, and he asked my mother to read it to me. And Jesus is talking to Thomas. Thomas says, "Where are you going?" And Jesus said, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow." But he wanted to know where he's going. And he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes unto the Father except through me." My mother started to read it, and on in verse 19, Jesus said to Thomas, "Because I live, you also shall live." Now, when I looked at that verse, something clicked within me. I said, this live is something more than what I know about living. And I said, "Jesus, if you are who you claim to be, this is the living I want. I want your life." And 5 days later, I walked out of there. About 40 years after that, or maybe 35 years after that, I was in Delhi. And shortly before that, when I was in my 20s, my mother passed away in Toronto. And so I put the verse on her gravestone, "Because I live, you also shall live." Because she read it to me, unknowing what it meant, and I came to know Christ, all right? So 1963, I come to know the Lord. 1974, my mother dies. I put that on her gravestone. 1990s, I'm visiting Delhi. And my children, my wife says, "Let's go and see your grandmother's grave." I didn't even know we'd find it. Found it. Swept aside the dirt with the help of the gardener there. Here's the gravestone, my grandmother's name, date of birth, date of death. Underneath, Jesus said, "Because I live, you also shall live." Jesus Christ says there's no amount of good deeds you and I can do that bring us into his presence. It's his grace, the counter perspective of the cross of Jesus Christ. It is the only worldview that exalts you without flattering you, but humbles you without humiliating you. The longer I have walked with Christ, the more certain I am that outside of him there are no answers.